The witch shoe is an absolute icon with its pointed toe and curled shape, but where did it come from? And how did it get to be so popular? More importantly, why does it look like the most uncomfortable shoe ever created? Well, I thought I knew all the answers to those questions as a shoe historian, but even I was wrong. The road these shoes walk to reach their current fame is long and twisted and full of unexpected turns. If you've seen some of my previous videos talking about shoe history, especially the most recent one on high heel history, you might recognize that they are very similar to the shoes that fashionable women were wearing from the turn to the 17th to the 18th century. And like me, you might assume that we chose this era to represent witch shoes because this is the era of the Salem witch trials that took place in the 1690s. And so this is the style of shoe that would have fashionably been worn at the same time. Must be that we looked back to a very big moment in American witch history to represent witches going forward. Well, not so much. Though with their strange and extreme shapes, their nubby textured leathers and visible rough stitches, it's not shocking that these would be taken up as creepy magical paraphernalia. It is undeniably one of the weirdest eras for shoes. And yes, they do look impossibly uncomfortable. Even if you are flying on a broom, you do have to eventually land. But there is only one way to find out if they are actually as uncomfortable as they look. So I'm going to tell you the story of how these shoes went from high fashion to high flying while I make a historically accurate pair of witch shoes. But first, before I get to selecting the materials for this project, I have a different type of high quality material I want to talk to you about. That's why I'm so thankful that the sponsor for today's video is Brooklinen. If you're looking for high quality home goods, Brooklinen has a wide range of luxury sheets and home essentials, all without the luxury price markup. I've actually been buying my sheets and towels from Brooklinen for almost a decade now, discovering them when I went looking for better options that would last longer. And as I've been spending a lot more time in my bedroom due to chronic illness, making sure that it's a cozy and beautiful space has been even more important. I've been adding in new decor, low lighting, and of course refreshing the bedding. Nothing can change the whole feel of a bedroom as easily. I went with the soft moss green and the coordinating pinstripe to match my walls and give me a really soft and cozy nesting feel. And it's no surprise that I really love green. And Brooklinen has so many fun color combinations, so you can find something no matter what your decor style. Their hardcore bundle lets you choose different colors for the sheets, duvet cover, and extra pillowcases. I'll definitely be mixing and matching my other sets as well. I also added the waffle bed blanket so I can wrap up and stay warm even when I'm not fully tucked into sleep. And the linen sheets are just the softest thing, but even help with temperature regulation. There's no reason to spend a third of your day, or more, uncomfortable. So head on over to their site to play around with creating a new and cozy design. And get 15% off your first Brooklinen order. Just follow the link to shop and save extra when you bundle. Thanks again to Brooklinen for sponsoring today's video. Now on to the materials for the shoe. There are a lot of different options for the shoe uppers in this era. You do see some fancier ones like silks, but I feel like leather is the far more appropriate choice for a pair of witch shoes. Specifically, I'm going to go with Morocco leather. This is a really heavily textured goat leather that was very popular in the 17th through the 19th centuries. It is still produced today. In fact, it's used pretty commonly in bookbinding, but it has a very almost unnatural texture to it, something that doesn't resemble any animal that you would be familiar with. It's just to do with the finishing process that causes this. This is not naturally how the hides look. So there's something about it that feels a little bit off that is absolutely perfect for this project, and it's a very common option that they used in the time period. So I'll be using a black Morocco for the uppers, a smoother black leather for the heel, and then obviously the rest of the goods are the typical heavier sole leathers, and a white Whitall leather for the rand, which is the little strip that runs around the outside, allowing me to stitch the sole onto the shoe. So basically almost all of the shoe, aside from a few things hidden inside, is going to be made out of leather. It just seems like the more appropriate option. Silk doesn't really fit, and even today leather feels a little bit more rustic, which does seem much appropriate, even though in the time period that we're looking at, they didn't think of these fashionable styles of shoes as related to witches at all. In fact, if you look at imagery from anywhere around this time period, you normally will see two types of options for witches' feet, one of which is barefoot. A lot of witches you see in this era aren't exactly wearing much clothing. So it'd be odd for them to be wearing a pair of shoes and nothing else. The other option that is pretty popular is a common shoe. Low-heeled, very sturdy, round toe, heavy leather, usually pretty beat up. They are the sorts of shoes that go along with more raggedy clothing. And that makes sense for the way that they were typically portraying witches at this time. So witches were not wearing pointed shoes, high heels, or anything remotely fashionable. Instead, plain shoes or barefoot is the type of imagery that would continue to be popular well into the 19th century. Now, with my variation on this, I'm also choosing a style that has a lot of visible stitching. To me, there is something that feels really pieced, patched together, bits of strange leather, feels very witchy. Now, I'm not adding a bunch of seams where there shouldn't be or putting in nonsensical decorative stitching. Instead, I'm basing it on this pair, which just felt a little creepy to me. The stitching is not only necessary for actually stitching the shoe together, but there's also a little bit of decorative stitching that I do suspect has some added purpose of kind of preventing stretch in some areas. There is no lining, there is very little infrastructure in the upper of the shoe, so there's not much else keeping it from stretching, which will actually lead to this potentially being a lot more comfortable than you would think. This also means that I'm choosing to go with the slightly earlier style of a tied shoe, which was really common in the 1690s. By the 1720s and 1730s, buckles were becoming much more common. They were very small at that time and would gradually grow in size throughout the rest of the 18th century. But large buckles were definitely not the commonality at this time, so that pilgrim shoe we're all used to seeing, not so much accurate. But the very large tongue that goes along with the buckle shoe is more accurate for a very brief time. So already we're starting to see how the modern witch shoes might be an amalgamation of a few different time periods. Granted, there's not a big difference between the 1690s and the 1730s in the eyes of most modern people, but it's already clear that it's not specific to one year or one event or one portrait. There's something else at play here. It's not until Halloween itself starts to gain popularity in the US in the late 19th century as the modern holiday that we are used to today, including all of its commercial popularity, that we start to see witches in something other than ragged clothes. And this, shockingly and somehow not shockingly, is the sexy witch. I know, before Halloween costumes and all of that was actually really a big thing, we started taking pictures of young women in cute costumes, lots of leg, being sexy versions of Halloween-related things. And the witch was one of those. So what they're wearing usually isn't very witch-like. It's much more costume, it's much more modern, and that includes their shoes. Now you might look at their shoes and see that they have buckles and pointed toes. Maybe they're trying to imitate shoes of the 1690s. Well, that's not the case. Shoes of that style were incredibly trendy and popular from the 1890s through to the 1920s. So there are a lot of examples of shoes with buckles, usually not functional, throughout that era. There were amazing examples from designers like Jan Torny that really resemble a vaguely 18th century shoe. They're not trying to make it one specific era. It's harkening back to the 18th century with the buckled shoes. It's harkening back to maybe the 17th century with a bit of a pointed toe, but the pointed toe came in the 1890s and didn't really go away, and that originally coming back in was not remotely related to the 17th century version with pointed toes. So it just happened to be that all of these things coalesced into accidentally looking like an early 18th century pair of shoes with a slightly bigger buckle than is normal, but no one was intentionally choosing for these sexy witches, or even the art that was not so sexy, that they were putting them in something historically accurate. In fact, the idea of the Salem witch trials being a key point in witch history wasn't really that big of a thing yet. Yes, some writings in the 19th century do talk about the Salem witch trials, and there is a bit more awareness of it, but it's not that much bigger than any of the other trials that took place in the US or in Europe. So it's just one of many. It is not the time period of witches. If anything, there's probably a stronger argument for the more medieval witch that shows up in fairy tales. And the type of pointed toes in the 1690s are dramatically different than the pointed toes in the 1890s or even 19-teens. In the 1690s, it's what we tend to refer to as a snub nose point. It looks almost rodent-like in a way. It curves in really sharply and then extends to a more rounded point. It's not a very tiny, minuscule point, nor is it a smooth, straight line to that point. That's what we tend to see more in the 1890s through the 19-teens and in modern day. We don't really ever fashionably repeat that strange snub nose point of the 1690s. It's also a much more curved up shape, in large part because the rest of the shoe is very curvy, as I will get to in just a minute, unlike the more modern point, which tends to have a little bit of toe spring just so you can walk, but not much of a curve up. It's definitely a strong choice to make. But it's this 19-teens pointed shoe with its vaguely 18th century styling, a buckle sometimes, a decent sized tongue, a curvier heel. That's what becomes solidified in the 1920s and 30s as we start to coalesce the idea of what Halloween is going to be as a commercial holiday. So all of the imagery that we had for the previous few decades prior to that of witches tended to be in these fashionable shoes just people already had that felt kind of old, like they would think of witches being from the days of yore, but not from any era specifically. And so rather than pop them into modern 1930s shoes, they just kind of kept that old style around and started to exaggerate it, make it a bit of a cartoon. One great example of this is from a company that has been making paper holiday decorations since the 1920s, and they're still around, still selling a lot of the same designs. And in the 1930s, at least by 1933, they were selling this witch. They still sell it today. And she has everything that we would think of as being traditionally witchy, especially when it comes to her shoes and her stockings. She has the horizontal striped stockings, which are vaguely historically accurate. They did exist, maybe not the most common style, and she has those buckled pointed shoes that are very much like the 19-teens version, but over-exaggerated and over-curved. Now, there is a possibility that someone on that design team back in the 1930s went and looked up some older styles of shoes, maybe went and specifically looked up 1690s shoes, though I doubt that, but they might have had some historical inspiration to add to it. Maybe they saw a pair in a museum at some point, though honestly, clothing in museums was not very common at that point. But it's just as likely that it is an over-exaggerated version of what was the popular old style of shoe in the 19-teens, that they just overextended those curves a little bit, brought the toe out and up a bit more, chose a curvier heel, and kept the buckle and the oversized tongue. Because in reality, even though this is an exaggerated version, it's not nearly as curvy as the very exaggerated versions of the 1690s. There are some examples that are just almost nonsense in how much curve they have. I personally had to build up my last, which is just a regular 18th century last. Would work for anywhere from the 1750s through to 1800. I've used it on lots of different shoes, including a 1720s pair that had a little bit of an upturned pointed toe, and that was perfectly fine, but this required a lot more change. So I actually built up the bottom of the last, which is not a very typical thing for me to do, and gave it that really low, deep curve of the sole at the bottom. I didn't over-exaggerate this like some of the examples because it's also the inside of the shoe that I'm shaping, not the outside. There's a lot of layers that are going to be added up before I get to the point of the final format. So this is meant to fit my foot, not to give me the shape of the shoe only, but we need to get closer to it, but still fit the foot. But I'm gonna see how far I can go, how exaggerated I can go with the shoe while still making sure that it is wearable. And it's actually the randed construction that I mentioned earlier which allows me to do this sort of build-up. So instead of being a turn shoe like I've done previous 18th century shoes on this channel for, where it's very lightweight, it's made inside out and flipped right side out and then the heel is attached, this is actually done completely right side out, and the rand is attached to the uppers, to the insole, and then brought over and anchored down. Then the sole will be attached to that. In the back, the heel is done much the same way, with the heel cover and the wooden heel being inserted, pasted in, and the sole being stitched around that heel breast, part of the heel underneath the foot. that will allow everything to stay in place and hold really tightly. It also, because of the curve of the heel and the way it extends, gives a lot of support under the arch of the foot. So while there's not a shank built up in this, I'm going to build up that shape in order to get more of an extreme curve on the outside. And adding in the heel and the extra shapes there, everything is really starting to balance together. Now these curves obviously carry over into the heel, which is not an extremely curvy heel in this case. It's fairly straight for the time period. You move forward about 20 years and it gets very curvy. It also gets very heavy and very clunky looking. So it's not that really exaggerated, almost pinched hourglass shape that you see on the over-exaggerated witches' shoes of the 20th century. If anything, this is much closer to the 1920s heels that would have been typical for the era. There's not nearly as much to it. It's just a very, very tall heel, but it's also angled down and with a little bit of a heel cup carved out. It's not quite as tall as it looks when you're standing on it. But the heels that we see on 20th century witch shoes tend to be one of two things, either a very tall, almost modern 1930s, 1940s style of heel, or that extreme curvy hourglass that never really existed. I am putting layers of cork in there in order to get the right shape. I could do leather here as well, though we do know that cork or a cork and paste type mixture that they would spread on was something that they had in the time. I've also used bits of wool, but having something other than just leather up against leather will keep the shoes from squeaking. That's where that actually comes from. So it's pretty important to have something in between those layers of leather, other than just more leather, so that way I don't have squeaky shoes. Add in the fact that I also just added about 3/4 of an inch of padding underneath the foot between the leather and the cork, so this is almost like a platform shoe at this point. So it seems less important what the heel shape is for 20th century witches. It's much more about the toe shape and the overall curves. The heel shape can be modern, the heel shape can be super curvy and cartoon and exaggerated, and this mix of variations and styles of witches' shoes is going to continue throughout the 20th century. You will still see the lower, rough, common shoes, you will see very high-heeled, curvy shoes, some that are long and pointed and stretched out with a sort of mid-height heel. There's just a lot of over-exaggeration to these options. And even in cases where they are straight up representing fairy tale old style witches like Wizard of Oz, those shoes are not at all witchy. They're red and glittery and very 1930s. They chose to go with a very modern style because, well, that's what Dorothy's going to be wearing for the whole rest of the movie. It'd be weird to have her in over-exaggerated curvy witch shoes. Additionally, there's not a lot of witch imagery in terms of historical witch imagery throughout the 20th century. I was actually shocked to see how few movies and TV shows there were that actually depict the Salem witch trials in any way. A lot of these are very brief mentions. They're not attempting to be historically accurate. When they are trying to be historical, they're usually just putting everyone in very Pilgrim Quaker-esque sort of over-exaggerated clothing. That's not actually accurate to what would have been worn in the 1690s in Salem. And none of those focus on shoes, so most of the people, if you do happen to see their shoes, are just wearing low-heeled, buckled shoes of the vaguely 18th century variety that just look older. They're not wearing historically accurate shoes in most cases. That was a really difficult thing to find throughout the 20th century. So we don't see examples of witches' shoes as we think of them until Hocus Pocus. This is the part that shocked me because I honestly thought that witches' shoes, the pointed stylistic type, would have had some other frame of reference, some other point of taking off in our modern consciousness throughout the 20th century, some other moment where they were incredibly popular and iconic, but no. They're just sort of sprinkled in through other examples of witches' shoes throughout that time period, and lots of the references that I found in newspapers mentioned witches' shoes in the format of some clunkier medical shoe styles that were colloquially made fun of as nun shoes or witches' shoes, implying the more rugged common shoe style, not the extremely pointed. And even with Hocus Pocus, in the 1990s, you have 3 examples of what have become traditionally known as witches' shoes. You have Mary in those common shoes. And you have Sarah in the laced-up, high-heeled boots with a pointed toe that would have been fashionable in the 1900 to 1920 point. Again, when we first started making a lot of imagery of witches. And you have the very over-the-top curvy pointed toe buckle shoes on Winifred, the ones that become the witch's shoes, and she even has the horizontal striped stockings. So I can only assume, knowing as much as I do about this movie and the effort that was put into vaguely historical but also very cartoonish versions of these characters. In fact, the first series of videos that I ever did for this channel was making a historically accurate Hocus Pocus outfit for Winifred and then forcing my friends to dress up and join me in running amok. I didn't make shoes for that at that time though, this has just taken me that long. But Winifred is very much wearing the shoes, the stockings, that I can only imagine are inspired one part by that 1930s paper witch that is still being produced today, as well as looking at some of the 1690s actually historically accurate clothing that would have been around. So it kind of combines the two, but that is one of the first physical examples of that style of witch shoe, rather than it just being over-exaggerated black lines and artwork. So that might actually be, in many ways, the turning point of what would become the witch shoe for us today. Because after that point, that becomes the icon of a witch shoe to the point where it exists entirely on its own outside of being with the rest of the witch's outfit. So whether it is that the association with the Salem witch trials is actually being taken into account and people are looking at historical examples of shoes from around the time is very doubtful, considering that the Salem witch trials weren't really the icon of witch-based things until the 20th century, and even then it really is not until the late 20th century that it really takes off. And doing research into a very specific time period of history for the vast majority of people in the 20th century would have been very difficult. There aren't a lot of books. There wasn't an online resource system of all of these collections around the world, so it would have been much more difficult for people to know what sort of shoes would have historically, accurately, been worn in the 1690s. Most people wouldn't have bothered. There's just a sense of these shoes look old, and that is much more likely to be where the origin is, that they took this vaguely historical style and over-exaggerated it, because that's what the average person would have been much more familiar with as we were starting to create this image of what a witch looks like, of what clothing items she wears, and those shoes are what was readily available and easy to exaggerate. So I honestly feel like there's a bit of a happy accident in the over-exaggeration of the 1900 styles getting closer and closer to the 1690 styles. And I'm sure there is a little bit of crossover. I'm not saying no one did any of the research, just saying that that wasn't the only source for this, because witches existed for a much longer period of history than just that era. And on top of that, it is such a strange time period for shoes. That's one of the reasons why we never really see a revival of it in the same way that you see for other eras. There are plenty of revivals of low-heeled, long-pointed shoes from the 1790s over and over and over again. There's all sorts of revivals of curvy heels versus straight heels, square toes versus round toes, and a whole range of different types of lacing systems and heights of boots and curviness and all these things. But we never really see the 1690s shoe come back because it is so incredibly difficult to make. If it's going to be made to be comfortable, it probably has to be custom made. I don't think this is something that you can really mass produce in the same way. Having worked on designing mass production historical shoes, this is not something that I could have asked for and actually gotten to look this curvy, and so many other elements that make this a very difficult style to produce, whether it is a mass production format or entirely by hand. This is one of the more difficult styles that I have made. Thankfully, I've done a lot of shoes from around the same era, so I know what I'm doing, but it still took a lot of trial and error to get the shape right, because the inside and the outside are two dramatically different shapes. But in the end, this produced a surprisingly comfortable shoe, which I can only credit to the fact that the heels of this era are very supportive and make sure that you aren't putting weight in one specific era. They're also set well under the heel of the foot, so your weight comes down in the right place as you're walking. And I have an extensive amount of padding underneath my foot, so this is a much cushier shoe than I'm used to having. The toe in the front extends so far outside of my foot shape that it really doesn't matter. There's nothing that's forcing my foot to curve up in the toes here. It does mean that I can walk and flex my ankle very easily, so the pointed toe is not going to physically trip me up like a lot of pointed toes do today. I'm not going to catch it on nearly as many things because it's up and out of the way. So I honestly am pretty shocked at how comfortable these shoes actually ended up being, despite the fact that they look so strange and twisted and nearly requiring magic to be functional shoes. So while I completely understand why this has become the witch shoe of today, why we have coalesced the 1690s and the Salem witch trials and the famous story that that has become, along with the birth of the witch imagery as a fun option rather than a scary folktale version of the witch from the woods, but instead a cute, fun, maybe even sometimes sexy witch of the 1900s and 19-teens. And the fact that we were able to sort of mingle the two of those pretty seamlessly is really an impressive story for such an impressive shoe. And if you are interested in a more in-depth video on the making of this pair of shoes, I will be putting a much lengthier instructional version of the making of these in the extra content section of my Patreon or in my YouTube memberships. And don't forget to subscribe because I have a lot more fun things coming your way.
Can you walk uphill?
Yeah, I can walk uphill a lot better than I can walk downhill, as I discovered.
Tippy taps, tippy taps, tippy taps.
It's just a little slippery and the heels aren't exactly large, so they have not been broken in yet.
Okay.